Airplanes are considered the safest mode of transportation. They can encounter turbulence, even crash, but what they cannot do is disappear without a trace. However, the story of Flight MH370 challenges this rule. On a dark March night in 2014, a massive Boeing 777 with 239 people on board literally vanished, leaving almost no evidence behind. This case quickly became one of the most astonishing mysteries in aviation history. Several countries took on the investigation of the disappearance of MH370, spending years and hundreds of millions of dollars. But even today, more than 10 years later, no one, from official authorities to enthusiasts on forums, can say for certain what happened. Numerous theories have been proposed. Could the plane have been hijacked by terrorists? Did the technology fail? Did the captain decide to end his life? Was it struck by lightning or a meteorite? Or was the aircraft shot down by the military? Aviation professionals are confident that a modern large airliner cannot simply disappear. On board, there is advanced equipment. On the ground, there are radars, and in space, there are satellites. All of this allows for precise knowledge of the aircraft's location at every moment of the flight. Even in the event of a disaster, systems record the place, time, and often even the cause. But not in the case of Flight 370. Years later, no one knows what really happened to it. We will attempt to unravel the mystery of the missing Malaysian Boeing. Let's reconstruct the complete chronological journey of Flight MH370, examine official reports, analyze the most popular theories, and try to understand where the truth lies. A quiet night and a routine flight. On March 8, 2014, nothing foreshadowed trouble. MH370 took off at 12:41 a.m. from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. It was a routine daily flight for Malaysia Airlines. Ahead lay approximately 5.5 hours of travel. The weather was excellent, and the forecast promised only a few areas of light turbulence. Nothing unusual for a modern airliner. The aircraft was piloted by the highly experienced Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a 53-year-old veteran with over 30 years of service at Malaysia Airlines, including many years of flying the Boeing 777. The co-pilot was Fariq Abdul Hamid, 27 years old, with about 4 years of experience. For Fariq, this was a training flight on the Boeing 777. Prior to this, he had completed only a few flights on such an aircraft. Nevertheless, his presence in the cockpit of a large modern airliner indicated high professional qualifications. In addition to the 2 pilots, there were 10 crew members on board, each with experience ranging from 10 to 30 years, a highly qualified team. The cabin of the aircraft held 227 passengers from various countries, with nearly 2/3 being citizens of China. Before takeoff, MH370 was refueled with enough fuel for approximately 7.5 hours of flight, which was a couple of hours more than needed for the route to Beijing. Such a reserve is standard procedure. At the time, it seemed like just a mundane technical detail. But later, every small fact would take on significance. Another important detail is the timing of events. At 12:40 a.m. local time, Flight MH370 received clearance for takeoff and began its ascent. The aircraft climbed to an altitude of 35,000 feet, about 10.5 kilometers, the standard cruising altitude. Communications with the ground were routine. The captain's voice was calm and confident, with no deviations. The aircraft was clearly displayed on radar screens, and during the first minutes of the flight, nothing suspicious occurred. However, just 7 minutes later, the first strange episode occurred. At 12:47 a.m., the captain of the flight suddenly re-established communication and reported that the aircraft was maintaining an altitude of 35,000 feet, something that had already been confirmed earlier. A second such report was clearly unnecessary and sounded unusual. Why did he do this? There could be several possible reasons, which we will discuss later. But immediately after this unnecessary communication, truly inexplicable events began to unfold with flight MH370. The last contact and disappearance. About 11 minutes after the strange altitude repetition, the aircraft reached the border between Malaysia and Vietnam, flying over the dark surface of the South China Sea. The controller in Kuala Lumpur handed Flight 370 over to Vietnamese air traffic control. He requested the crew to establish communication with the control center in Ho Chi Minh City and said goodbye. Captain Zahari responded with his usual calm farewell. However, even in this last radio message, there was an intriguing moment. The Malaysian controller dictated the frequency for communication with Vietnam, a series of numbers, and according to protocol, Zahari was supposed to confirm it by repeating it aloud. He did not do so. In any case, no further communication was received from MH370. The aircraft did not establish contact with the Vietnamese controllers. Almost immediately after the farewell message, the airliner disappeared from radar screens. At that moment, one of the most significant mysteries in aviation history was born. Initial speculations: accident or escape plan? The aircraft disappeared, and the first explanation that comes to mind is that it likely crashed into the ocean where it vanished from radar. However, it soon became clear that Flight 370 remained airborne for several more hours after it disappeared from screens. Moreover, the point at which the airliner ceased to be observed turned out to be almost perfect, as if someone had deliberately wanted to make the aircraft invisible. By that time, MH370 had already left Malaysian airspace, but had not yet formally entered Vietnam's area of responsibility. In short, the disappearance occurred at an ideal moment, right between the two air traffic control regions. Everything that happened to the aircraft after it vanished from radar became the subject of years of investigations, debates, and even conspiracy theories. We will rely on the facts, of which there have been many accumulated over the years. But first, it is worth clarifying what the expression "vanished from radar" actually means. What does vanished from radar mean? How does a large airliner manage to disappear from the controller's screens? The fact is that a passenger aircraft is visible to ground control systems for almost the entire duration of the flight. But there are two types of radar. The first type is the classic ground radars, those rotating antenna dishes. They emit a signal and catch the reflection from the aircraft. This technology is quite old. It provides only an approximate location and altitude of the target and has a limited range. Today, air traffic controllers primarily rely on the second type of radar, a system that receives signals from the aircraft itself. Each airliner is equipped with special transponder devices that automatically transmit information about the aircraft to the ground, its exact position, coordinates, altitude, speed, and other parameters. This is how popular services like flight radar operate. Anyone interested can track in real time on a map where passenger planes are flying around the world. To vanish from radar in the context of modern aviation means to stop transmitting data from the transponders. This can only occur in two cases. Either all of these onboard transmitters failed simultaneously, or someone manually turned them off. In such a situation, the aircraft is no longer visible on the screens of ground services, except on outdated primary radars, and even then with significant inaccuracies. Essentially, this is exactly what happened with MH370. Its signal disappeared from civilian radars shortly after the last communication session. Confusion on the ground and lost hours. On the ground, no one initially realized that something extraordinary had occurred. The Malaysian controller in Kuala Lumpur was apparently busy with other flights and did not immediately notice the disappearance of MH370's signal. When the absence of the aircraft on the screen was discovered, the controller assumed that the airliner had simply exited his area of responsibility and was flying in Vietnamese airspace. At the same time, Vietnamese controllers noted that Flight 370 had entered their airspace and then also disappeared from their screens. According to regulations, if an aircraft does not make contact, they must notify their colleagues in Kuala Lumpur within 5 minutes. However, this was not done. Instead, staff in Ho Chi Minh City spent about 20 minutes trying to contact the aircraft by radio themselves. Only after this precious time did they inform their Malaysian counterparts that they had lost communication with the flight. In response, the Malaysian side contacted Malaysia Airlines, and they initially assured that everything was fine. According to their data, the aircraft was flying as planned somewhere over Cambodia. As it later turned out, this data was based not on the actual location of MH370, but on a pre-programmed flight plan. Nevertheless, around 2 a.m., all services were confident that the flight was proceeding normally. None of them paid attention to the barely noticeable signals from those old radar stations. According to them, some aircraft continued its flight, just not in the direction that MH370 was supposed to be flying. Due to all this confusion, no one raised the alarm in a timely manner. According to protocol, if a passenger aircraft disappears from radar, aviation authorities must be notified within an hour. However, in the case of MH370, precious time was lost. The aircraft was officially declared missing only after 4 hours, when it failed to land on time in Beijing. Only then did the situation become critical. Naturally, the initial search began where the aircraft lost contact, in the South China Sea. Several dozen aircraft and ships from Malaysia and Vietnam scoured vast areas above and below the water. No traces of MH370 were found. An unexpected turn, the secret route of MH370. It was only several days after the disappearance of the flight that researchers managed to piece together scattered fragments of data and uncover a shocking truth. MH370 had not been flying in the direction it was supposed to all along. Data from surviving primary radars and information from the military allowed for the reconstruction of the approximate flight path after it vanished from civilian radars. The aircraft made a sharp turn of nearly 180 degrees in the area between Vietnam and Malaysia, then crossed Malaysian territory, circled around the Indonesian islands, and sharply turned south. After that, the Boeing 777 flew for several more hours, directly toward the vast Indian Ocean, until it finally disappeared from radar coverage. This strange trajectory indicated one thing. What had happened was almost certainly not an accident or a random technical failure. The aircraft did not fall suddenly. It deliberately changed course and continued flying. In other words, everything appeared to be a well-planned operation. But why? For what purpose? And where, finally, are the aircraft and the more than 200 passengers? Searching for a needle in a haystack is no easy task, but it's much worse when you have no idea where the haystack itself is located. This is roughly the situation the Malaysian authorities found themselves in, realizing that MH370 had disappeared not where they had initially searched. Moreover, the first report of the unexpected maneuver of Flight 370 did not come from official sources, but from journalists who obtained the information through their channels. Only after that were Malaysian officials forced to confirm, yes, radar data indicated a completely different route for the aircraft after it vanished from the screens. Satellite data. The accident theory is ruled out. Unexpectedly, a key clue in the investigation was provided by the satellite company Inmarsat from London. Although it does not track flights, its data, combined with radar information, helped reconstruct the complete path of the missing aircraft, while simultaneously ruling out several straightforward theories about what happened. The entire flight of MH370 was conditionally divided into two parts. The first part, about 40 minutes of normal flight until the transponders were turned off and approximately another hour afterward, is reliably known thanks to data from civilian and military radars. The second part, approximately 6 more hours of flight south, was reconstructed from weak satellite signals. The most obvious hypothesis initially suggested that an abnormal situation occurred on board, such as a fire or electronic failure that disrupted communication. However, the analysis of the route and technical details effectively ruled out the theory of an accidental crash. Here are several important facts. The transponders of MH370 did not stop transmitting their signal instantly and simultaneously. Instead, they did so in stages. First, part of the equipment was turned off, and 37 seconds later, the remainder followed. Such a gradual scenario is much more indicative of a manual shutdown of systems than a sudden failure due to fire or explosion. The sharp turn of the aircraft nearly 180 degrees was executed manually by someone. Subsequent tests showed that the autopilot of the Boeing 777 cannot automatically perform such a steep maneuver. This means that someone at the controls deliberately turned the aircraft at that moment. If an accident had occurred on board, for example, a fire, it would be logical to assume that the crew, having turned the aircraft, would have attempted an emergency landing at the nearest airfield. However, MH370, after turning, did not attempt to land. It continued flying hour after hour. This behavior does not fit a scenario where pilots are trying to save the aircraft from a crash. During the portion of the course deviation tracked by ground radars, the aircraft flew with slight course oscillations, as if it were being gently steered. from time to time. Such deviations are typical of manual control and practically rule out the theory that the pilots lost consciousness, for example, due to smoke inhalation or depressurization. All these facts point to one conclusion: MH370 was not the victim of a random technical failure or pilot error. The aircraft was deliberately taken off course and continued flying under someone's control. Unprecedented searches and aircraft debris. The subsequent efforts to search for MH370 turned into one of the largest operations in history. During the first 2 months after its disappearance, dozens of aircraft and ships from several countries scoured hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. They searched in areas where debris was logically expected, first in the South China Sea, at the point of lost communication, then in the Andaman Sea, in the region where the aircraft was last detected by military radars, and finally, in the southern part of the Indian Ocean when data from Inmarsat satellites became available. The result was zero. After 2 months of unsuccessful attempts, the main effort shifted to underwater investigations of the ocean floor. It was assumed that the Boeing had crashed somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, far from the shores. Australia joined the operation, equipped with more advanced deep-sea scanning technology. The primary goal was to locate the aircraft's flight recorders, black boxes. Over several years, researchers systematically surveyed hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of the ocean floor, spending over $100 million. However, they failed to find anything at all. After some time, Malaysia engaged the private American company Ocean Infinity for the search, with the condition of a reward only in the case of success. In 2018, its vessels scoured the suspected crash area once more, and again without results. However, in July 2015, 16 months after the aircraft's disappearance, the first real piece of evidence emerged. Local workers found a large wing fragment, a so-called flaperon, on the beach of Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean. Serial numbers confirmed that it belonged to the very same Boeing 777 of flight MH370. In the following years, a total of about 24 fragments of the aircraft were discovered along the coast of Madagascar and nearby islands. Only a few of them could be accurately identified as parts of the missing plane. The others were highly likely to belong to it as well. There was no mention of any other missing Boeing 777 in that area. Importantly, no traces of an explosion or fire were found on any of the recovered debris. This further reinforced the theory that the tragedy of Flight 370 was the result of human actions rather than an onboard explosion or missile attack. Additionally, earlier satellite analysis had almost certainly established that the aircraft ended its flight in the southern part of the Indian Ocean. Studies of ocean currents indicated that the debris would eventually be carried to the shores of East Africa, which is exactly what happened. In 2018, Malaysian authorities published the final investigation report, almost 450 pages long. Unfortunately, it shed little light on the situation. The document mainly recounted the technical specifications of the Boeing 777, the timeline of the search efforts, and the available radar data. The conclusion stated that the true causes of the aircraft's disappearance could not be determined. Nevertheless, even in this essentially useless document, it was acknowledged that the disabling of the transponders and other tracking systems on board was likely carried out manually by someone on board. and we remember that this was done in the most ideal location between control zones, allowing the aircraft to disappear unnoticed. The main questions remain: who did this and why? Versions, rumors, and conspiracy theories. In the absence of clear answers, numerous theories have emerged around MH370, ranging from professionally grounded to outright fantastical. Many of these theories are based on the analysis of available facts and mathematical calculations of the trajectory, proposed by current and former pilots, aviation engineers, and safety experts. The arguments of these specialists have been largely presented above and will be further elaborated on later in our narrative. At the same time, many speculative scenarios emerged that can be classified as conspiracy theories. Some of these became so popular that they formed the basis for major documentary films, such as the series about MH370 on Netflix. Here are a couple of examples of such theories. Shot down by the military. According to one theory, Flight MH370 was allegedly shot down by the American military from the Diego Garcia base, which is located on an atoll in the Indian Ocean. Why? Either because the aircraft was about to attack this secret base, or because the military mistook it for a hostile aircraft that was not responding to inquiries. After this, proponents of the theory claim radar data was falsified and debris was planted in the ocean to conceal the truth. Flight to the north. Another hypothesis suggests that after turning off the coast of Indonesia, the aircraft did not head south to an uninhabited area, but flew north and crashed somewhere in Central Asia, for example, in the vicinity of Kazakhstan. The problem with all these theories is that they contradict objective data. Within the professional aviation community across different countries, there is virtually no disagreement regarding the actual route of MH370. It has been mathematically calculated based on satellite signals and radar markings, and no alternative trajectory that does not align with the southern direction is supported by the facts. However, even the most experienced pilots and investigators still cannot definitively say what exactly happened on board that night flight. There are various hypotheses regarding the sequence of events and motivations. Let's examine the most likely versions of what occurred. Version: external interference is unlikely. The first thought in such mysterious disasters is whether it was a hijacking by terrorists. Unfortunately, aircraft hijackings have occurred multiple times in history. Just think of D.B. Cooper's case in 1971, or the tragedy of September 11, 2001. However, in the case of MH370, the theory of a hijacking by outsiders seems extremely implausible. Here's why. The cockpit was virtually inaccessible. On the Boeing 777, the cockpit door is equipped with reinforced locks and control systems. Pilots can see on a camera who is standing at the door. Moreover, the first disappearance of the aircraft from radar occurred just a couple of minutes after the captain casually said goodbye to the dispatcher. It is unlikely that during this time, any passenger managed to burst into the cockpit, especially without any sounds or signs of struggle. Perfectly timed, the disappearance of MH370 occurred precisely between the areas of responsibility of two countries. It is hard to believe that random hijackers could have timed their actions so perfectly. to disable communication right in the blind spot between Malaysia and Vietnam. It seems as if the person planning this knew the schedule and boundaries of control. Lack of distress signals. If an assailant had burst into the cockpit, the pilots would have had a chance to send a distress signal by pressing a couple of buttons and transmitting a hijacking code, which takes seconds. However, no emergency code or uncommunicated message from MH370 was ever heard. Equipment sabotage is unlikely. Theoretically, one could disable transponders and communication by sneaking into the technical compartment beneath the cabin floor. However, it is extremely difficult to imagine that an assailant opened a hatch in the floor and fiddled with electronics in front of 200 passengers without anyone noticing. Passenger checks yielded nothing. Investigators thoroughly examined the backgrounds of all 239 people on board, including the crew. It was discovered that 2 passengers were traveling on stolen passports, young men from Iran. However, the investigation found no connections to terrorists. They were likely just seeking to emigrate and looking for asylum. No one else on board raised any suspicions. Absence of demands and responsibility. Typically, terrorist organizations claim responsibility for attacks or make demands. In the case of MH370, there were no statements from any groups or ultimatums issued. The aircraft disappeared and no one claimed it was their doing. Such anonymity is not characteristic of organized terrorist acts. It is worth mentioning that there were even theories about some high-tech interference, such as the idea that the aircraft was remotely hacked or that new weaponry was tested on it. However, experts dismiss such notions. There is currently no realistic way to completely take control of a modern airliner from the outside, especially without being noticed. All the facts indicate that the control of MH370 was carried out directly from the cockpit. Thus, the most complex version remains. Someone among the 2 pilots of the flight is involved. But who exactly? The captain or the first officer? And why? When the pilot becomes the hijacker themselves. The idea that an airliner pilot intentionally destroyed their own aircraft sounds outrageous. However, unfortunately, there have been such cases in history. In 1999, Egypt Air Flight 990, New York, Cairo. Half an hour after takeoff, the Boeing 767 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. An American investigation concluded that this was a deliberate act by the first officer, who disabled the autopilot and directed the aircraft downward. 217 people died. In 2014, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 702, Addis Ababa, Rome. During the flight, the captain went to the restroom, and the first officer immediately locked the door, taking control for himself. He redirected the Boeing 767 to Geneva Airport, where it landed safely, and he requested political asylum in Switzerland. None of the passengers were harmed. In 2015, German Wings Flight 9525, Barcelona, Düsseldorf. The first officer waited for the captain to leave for the restroom, locked the cockpit door, and intentionally directed the Airbus A320 downward. The aircraft crashed in the Alps, killing 150 people. The investigation revealed that the pilot had serious mental health issues that he had concealed from his employer. These are just a few examples. Each of these cases shocked the public and led to stricter pilot screenings. However, they confirm that pilots are also human with their own problems, and sometimes the human factor can result in an intentional disaster. Therefore, in the investigation of MH370, the backgrounds of both pilots were scrutinized particularly closely. Their biographies, medical records, psychological state, family relationships, and financial situation all were examined under a microscope. First officer, without signs of malicious intent. The junior pilot of flight MH370, 27-year-old Farik Abdul Hamid, did not seem to fit the role of a villain at first glance. His life was progressing well. According to the investigation, Farik was soon to be married, and his career was on the rise. He had just been entrusted with the position of first officer on one of the largest aircraft in the world, the Boeing 777. At such a young age, this was a very prestigious appointment, paving the way for a bright future in aviation. Nevertheless, the investigation sought any leads, and one strange detail did emerge. The report from Malaysian investigators mentions that after the aircraft had turned away from its planned course, the second pilot's mobile phone unexpectedly activated. While flying over Penang Island, Malaysia, the iPhone belonging to Farik briefly connected to the cellular network. It was not a call, just a connection to a ground tower, indicating that the phone was turned on. According to regulations, pilots' personal devices must be switched off during flight. Therefore, either someone turned on Farik's phone after all the events had transpired, or he himself attempted to use the connection to call someone or report an emergency. The true reason for this brief signal remains unknown. Interestingly, the information about the second pilot's iPhone did not become public right away. It leaked to the press through internal materials from the investigation. The final official report did not include this data at all. It remains unclear why Malaysian authorities decided to conceal such a seemingly innocuous fact. This sparked a new wave of suspicion regarding the investigation, but no direct evidence against Farik was ever found. There was not a shred of evidence that the second pilot could have been planning a hijacking or suicide. As a result, the primary focus shifted to the figure of the captain. Captain, the main suspect. Zaharia Ahmad Shah, the 53-year-old captain of MH370, also did not fit the profile of a secret hijacker at first glance. He was a very experienced pilot, over 30 years with the airline, commanding the Boeing 777 since the late 1990s. His reputation was impeccable, married with 3 children, and no financial or medical issues were identified. Colleagues spoke highly of him, noting his composure. Before the flight, investigators did not notice anything unusual in Zahari's behavior or in the airport video footage. No facial expressions or gestures that indicated stress or an unusual state. In his free time, the captain was interested in electronics and also flew at home on a flight simulator. He even had his own YouTube channel for aviation enthusiasts. It seemed that Zahari had no motives for causing a disaster either. However, a number of discovered facts made the captain the primary object of suspicion. Rumors circulated in the press that the pilot's personal life was not entirely smooth. Allegedly, he had separated from his wife and was having an affair. These claims have not been officially confirmed by the family, so they should be approached with caution. A truly intriguing piece of evidence, however, came from the captain's home flight simulator Among hundreds of saved and deleted files of training flights, investigators found a route that ended in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, approximately where MH370 is believed to have disappeared, according to calculations. In simpler terms, Zahari had modeled a flight on his computer that suspiciously resembled the one taken by the missing aircraft. The details of this finding are chilling. Unlike most of the captain's other virtual flights, this route on the simulator did not have a designated landing point. Typically, a pilot while training selects an airport and makes a landing there. However, in that session, Zahari repeatedly practiced takeoff and a long flight to nowhere, until the fuel was completely depleted without landing. Moreover, it turned out that the captain had attempted to erase this data, but experts were able to recover it. Initially, the Malaysian authorities were not quick to make this information public. Data about the strange route leaked to the press from non-public investigation materials, and only after the leak did officials acknowledge that, yes, a flight with a similar trajectory had indeed been saved on Zahari's home simulator, and that it had been deleted by the pilot himself. In their report, investigators concluded that this could have been a mere coincidence unrelated to the MH370 tragedy. Some independent experts agreed with this conclusion, suggesting that aviation enthusiasts model all sorts of routes. On the other hand, a number of specialists believe that the likelihood of a coincidental match here is exceedingly low. If the captain had rehearsed the fateful flight in advance, it would explain a lot. There is no direct evidence of Zahari Ahmad Shah's guilt. It cannot be stated with 100% certainty that he was the one who orchestrated the hijacking of Flight 370 and brought about the plane's demise. We only have circumstantial evidence. However, one thing can be said for certain: the person who carried this out was well prepared and knew exactly what they were doing. Based on the totality of the facts, the captain fits this description best. In conclusion, the mystery remains unsolved. As of today, the investigation has officially been halted and active searches are no longer underway. Not a single body has been found. All existing debris, around 20 fragments, has not provided a definitive answer regarding the cause of the disaster. This means that neither the relatives of the 239 missing individuals nor the global community know exactly what happened and why. Many independent experts agree on the location of the aircraft's crash, somewhere in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, but it remains unclear how the final phase of the flight unfolded. The plane could have simply descended smoothly, depleting all its fuel, or it could have been deliberately directed downward by the pilot's hand. This nuance could shed light on the motives behind the incident, but it could only be determined through the discovery of the black boxes, or at least the exact crash site. It is almost certain that for the last couple of hours, Flight MH370 was flying in daylight. This means that the person at the controls, most likely the only living person on board, witnessed the dawn of a new day while continuing to execute their grim plan. The only hope for fully uncovering this mystery lies in someday finding more substantial fragments of the aircraft, such as the black boxes. However, considering the vast expanses of the ocean and the enormous costs involved, such searches are unlikely to resume anytime soon. This means that the case of Flight MH370 remains, and may forever remain, one of the greatest enigmas in aviation history.